Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. Aware was formed after the attacks of 9/11/2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who saw that the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Middle East. Some people even think that the U.S. government staged the 9/11 events to give it an excuse to attack the world's greatest oil-producing region, the Middle East. But unfortunately, the U.S. government didn't need an excuse. It had been killing people in the Mideast for 2 generations to secure control of those energy resources. The Obama administration, which promised hope and change, simply continued the numerous murderous policies of earlier administrations, often with the same personnel, like the Secretary of Defense, and simply lied about what it was doing. Today we see the war policy being carried on in 2 vicious wars by American client states, Ukraine and Israel. Israel has massacred more than 600 people in Gaza, mostly civilians, and the U.S.-backed and installed government in Kiev has killed hundreds in eastern Ukraine. And its war this week resulted in the destruction of a commercial airliner that killed 298 men, women, and children. Who is responsible for the Israeli military assault on Gaza? Many people can be blamed for Israel's committing what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime, launching aggressive war, but the final responsibility lies with the President of the United States. Without the support, economic, military, political, and diplomatic, that the U.S. government provides, Israel's crimes would not be possible. But the U.S. does not provide this support because of undue influence from the government of Israel or from the Israel lobby, as you hear some people say. The U.S. government supports Israel and its oppression of Palestinians because Israel is America's stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East. Our government has been killing people in the Mideast since the Second World War to secure control of what the U.S. State Department then called the world's greatest material prize, Mideast gas and oil. The U.S. government demands not just access to Mideast energy resources, but control of them, because a stranglehold over world energy gives the U.S. the advantage over its economic rivals in Europe and Asia, notably Germany and China. President Obama fails to stop Israel's ongoing murders in Gaza, as he could, with a word, but it's been the policy of all U.S. administrations for 2 generations to allow the Israelis to continue their oppression of the Palestinians so long as Israel supports and participates in the crimes of its U.S. master. Washington uses 1,000 military bases around the world and its special forces active in 124 countries. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder, to control the world economy in the interests of the 1%. That control is not in the interests of the vast majority of Americans who pay for it. And although Americans don't know it, Obama has killed thousands of people with drone strikes alone, including hundreds of children. No other country, not China or Russia, has foreign bases or conducts similar killing. No wonder the U.S. is hated around the world. But Obama's main task is to convince Americans that he's withdrawing from the war, although he clearly isn't. 3/4 of Americans disapprove of the wars of the Bush-Obama years and the billions of dollars spent on them that could have been used here at home. Obama was elected to end the wars and provide jobs. He hasn't done either one, and Americans' anger is growing. His job is to turn aside that anger. One way that's done is to use a compliant media to misrepresent the Obama administration's military and economic policies. Our task here at Aware on the Air, like similar independent programs around the country, is to combat that overwhelming propaganda. We'll try to do that tonight with reports and comments from David Green on the situation in Palestine, Ron Zoke on Darkness Ascending, Deb Johnson on the downed airliner in Ukraine, Karen Evans-Levy on local political demonstrations, and Karen Aram on the pivot to Asia. And we'll start with David Green.
Thanks. I want to make a few comments in relation, of course, to Israel-Palestine. I'm thinking in historical terms what an innocent country we were in 1967 when Israel invaded and occupied parts of Egypt and the West Bank and Gaza, which it has, and Syria, which it has occupied ever since, except in the case of Egypt. It seemed to many people at that time that the Middle East was kind of a sideshow. And what Carl has just said, of course, is accurate. The Middle East and its oil resources have, of course, been central to U.S. policy, but it was hard to understand that in the middle of our Southeast Asian wars in the 1960s. We had an incursion into Lebanon in 1958, and we had supported the overthrow of a popular leader in Iraq in 1963, but the Middle East was largely not on the radar of most people. Nor was Israel central to the radar of even most American Jews at that time. 1967 changed all that, and 47 years later, we are dealing with that in this sort of increasing consciousness and increasing horror about what's gone on in there, of course, given our subsequent involvements in Afghanistan, Iraq, events in Iran, and so on. So how do we understand this in this historical context? Well, Carl has certainly stated what that context is. What about the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which isn't simply identical to that? That conflict goes back to, I think we can date the struggle of the Palestinians for some rights and some sovereignty and some statehood, at least back to the 1930s, when there was a rebellion in British Mandatory Palestine of Palestinian fighters against the British, I guess what could be called occupiers at that time. So we're dealing here with what is really an 80-year-old struggle. I think, and just to bring us to the present, I think one of the most important things I've heard, and it's not for the first time, what Norman Finkelstein said in a recent interview on Democracy Now!, that when Israel attacks the Palestinian territories, whether it be the West Bank or Gaza, recently most often Gaza in recent years, it's to prevent a peace agreement between the two factions of the Palestinians, Fatah and Hamas. And it's to prevent the possibility that a peace agreement in a unified front, as what happened recently, would present a unified face to the world and convince the world that the Palestinians really want what the international community has wanted for the last 10 or 20 or 30, 40 years, is that as a solution along the lines of the pre-1967 borders. These invasions are to prevent the possibility of that happening, to demonize Hamas. It's becoming increasingly hard for Israel to demonize Hamas and to characterize it as another example of Al-Qaeda, another example of Islam, Islamofascism. These things become increasingly harder in public opinion. The polling, CNN has a poll out now that shows that over 50%, maybe close to 60% of U.S. citizens polled still support Israel in this conflict. But that has changed over the years from a much more overwhelming majority. And when it shows that nearly 40% of Americans disapprove of Israel's invasion of Gaza, that's a tremendous shift in public opinion over the last 40 years. Absolutely. They deceive you when they say, well, only 14% support the Palestinian Authority. Supporting the Palestinian Authority, for those who understand what's going on in the Middle East, isn't what you do if you oppose Israel's incursion into Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is seen by people who support the Palestinians and by the Palestinians themselves as basically a collaborationist government with the Israeli occupiers. and with the United States. So these things have shifted in the 80 years, 40 years, 20 years, 10 years. There have been dramatic shifts in the context of the U.S.'s increasing involvement in the Middle East and increasing opposition to that. There may not be much that seems to be hopeful for in terms of Israel's overwhelming power and its ability to do what it has done, but with each incursion from 2008 to 2012 to this one, Israel, the consciousness in terms of Palestinian rights grows, and opposition to Israel grows in the context of more Americans' understanding of what our interests in the Middle East actually are. So I think there's reason for guarded optimism. There's reason for encouragement for continued organizing and struggle in this matter, both in terms of Israel and Palestine, and in opposition to U.S. involvement in that region.
Thank you, David. Important comments from David Green. Comments from the panel, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm not sure I really see that shift yet in American public opinion, but it's happening in Europe and to some extent here, I think.
I think people are becoming much better educated here, but I agree that the shift has also, like supporting the Palestinian Authority is completely different than saying that you approve of. Support the Palestinians.
With each incursion, with each year, and with this in particular, it becomes increasingly harder for the media and the narrative to frame the Israel-Palestine conflict in the frame that it was in 1967 against, feisty underdog Jews against Palestinians. Obviously, you can't maintain that narrative anymore, but there's still a sort of the media expects you to sort of understand at some level that there's some kind of a threat here, that Israel is just fighting back, and that somehow the Palestinians represent this larger Islamic force. Given the manner in which this is being covered now, and we saw in the last week the controversy over the removal of a person of Arabic background from NBC coverage in Gaza, and then after a brouhaha, he's been allowed to go back there. We see at least cracks in the way that the media has covered this, and it sort of increasingly transparent. The sort of increasing transparency of the false narrative that this is part of this global struggle against Islamofascism.
I was simply going to say that on the media this morning, CNN, I heard them complaining that because we don't show bodies, it's our policy, as if this is a good thing. We don't show bodies on television. They did a long time ago, but they don't anymore. But somehow social media is showing all of this in war, that somehow social media has an unfair advantage in expressing truth to people. But they were actually almost complaining that somehow this isn't right, and that we're clean because we don't show bodies. Basically, they don't show war. They don't show the real atrocities. They don't show what's really happening. They don't show the truth.
I didn't even know that, Karen. I mean, that's news to me, since I guess I don't watch the mainstream media enough. Their policy, even though we see all kinds of vivid photographs of dead Palestinian children, they are not showing any of those on the evening news on CNN?
No, and this was actually the speaker, his last name is Cessny. He's the director of George Washington University Media and Communications. And he was making this statement.
Well, the problem was noted by no less a personage than the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, who, when asked about the vast number of civilian casualties as a result of his attack on Gaza, said, well, they're telegenically dead.
What does that mean?
Meaning that, that all those bodies look good on television in order to elicit sympathy for the
RT
for the Gazans.
Yeah. RT and Democracy Now! Will show it.
But
RT
Russian Times
and Democracy Now!, but you will not see it on CNN.
I'd like to go back to the point that David started with, the innocence of 1967 America, and I'm a little skeptical of that, and the notion that one looks to the national history and refers to an innocent time. It seems to me one is frequently talking about oneself. That would be
Guilty as charged.
no, but I'm saying that the same is true of me, but
Yeah, me too.
this is not an accident in terms of the questions we're talking about. I remember vividly the run-up to the 1967 war and the propaganda of just the sort that you're describing here, the propaganda in the American media, when of course there was no internet, no social media, the propaganda in the American media about how Israel was going to be forced to do something about the terrible belligerence of Egypt. Only later do we find that that Israel provoked the war and started it. But we didn't know that. And those of us, young and callow as we were, who were listening to Walter Cronkite and the evening news, for all we knew, here was brave little Israel putting up against a serious threat. And my goodness, they're going to have to do something, aren't they?
Carl?
That was pervasive. That was everywhere.
It wasn't. It
and
was
there was
everywhere.
no challenge to it.
It was everywhere. I was in Paris in 1967 during the Israeli Six-Day War, and I don't read French, but I got enough Western information or English language information that I joined a pro-Israeli rally in defense of Israel. I actually thought Egypt had attacked Israel.
Everybody did. That was what one knew in the American through the American media.
And there were thousands out there in the streets demonstrating.
Now, France is peculiar in this regard.
Yeah.
There's a very good two very good articles on Counterpunch this week about the peculiar knots the French have tied themselves into on these matters.
Yeah.
But
ironically, 1967 was the start of the French's disillusionment with Israel and their ceasing arms sales to them, and the beginning of Israel's reliance on us, the U.S., for their arms shipments.
But if we
just to conclude, one of Norman Finkelstein's recent books is called "Knowing Too Much," and that's really what this process has been for the last 47 years. Is now we really know too much to understand with that alleged innocence of that. I mean, I was never callow, okay, but I was innocent. I'll have to look up to see what callow actually means.
Actually, it was before you grew your beard. But
I see. Okay.
That line, Finkelstein's line, is in fact from a remark by Noam Chomsky. He says that's why people don't study history. It just teaches you too much. And this is a wonderful example. An example in this morning's paper that's one of the most egregious I've seen in a while. Takes me back to the propaganda control of our knowledge of these things in 1967. The propaganda was just as bad. It was simply more pervasive. But look at this morning's New York Times. Even I, in my cynical old age, am shocked by this. The lead article, right-hand column, Israel is facing difficult choice in Gaza conflict. The subtitle is "More Civilian Deaths or Letting the Enemy Live to Fight Again." Now think about that. That's just incredible. This is this Rudoran person who's been writing the most incredible propaganda in the New York Times that's equal the sort of thing that was being heard in 1967. But imagine a similar article in the New York Times in September of 1939. Germany is facing difficult choice in Polish conflict. More civilian deaths or letting enemy live to fight again?
Yeah.
Well, the answer would have been clear, right? The Poles have got to die. But we put it in that context and we see the ridiculousness of it, but there it is on the front page.
Terrible dilemma. Do we implement the final solution to the Hamas problem?
Exactly. That's exactly
Well,
right.
most of the copy newspapers are owned by rich Jewish people. So, I mean, come on. I mean,
now,
I mean,
Deb,
really.
I don't think you can get
Let's
away
not
with
label
that.
Jewish
it's
people.
not-
Well, no, but
Jewish
it's the truth,
conspiracy.
though.
You
It's
don't
the
have
truth.
to
It doesn't matter.
And I'm not,
You don't have
listen,
to
I
be
don't have
Jewish to
anything
like,
against
yeah,
anyone,
right.
personally, but
It's not about the religion.
most
it's about
of
their
the
being
large,
wealthy.
the
corporates.
larger copy are owned by rich Jewish people, and that's all I'm going to say.
But it's their membership in the 1% not the
That's-
fact,
right,
not the fact
exactly.
that their ancestors were supposed to have come from the Middle East. That's the issue, and I think it's very dangerous. I think we've seen some dangerous examples of that on the AWARE email list.
Well, I think the
recently
proof
of
is in
people
your
who take up that
copy.
notion. Beg pardon?
I think the proof is what you just said, what you just read out of the New York Times. I think there's your proof, because
but-
they're certainly not going to have a front page article asking for help for the Palestinians. You're never going to see that in that paper.
But that's not because there are Jews on the staff. It's because the New York Times is a semi-official newspaper for the American government.
Well,
and the
yes, I
American
agree with
establishment.
that. I totally agree with that.
It's
I
too
totally
easy. We
agree with
give
that.
our opponents an easy victory
Right.
if we suggest that there's some nefarious plot producing the news that they're hearing. It's the plot's open and obvious, and
Yeah.
we should call it by its right name, it seems to me. You're listening to Aware on the Air, watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Ron Zoke, Darkness Ascending.
I was reminded of the reign of darkness by an interview I saw with Richard Perley this week. Actually, he was a competitor for the title Prince of Darkness
Yes.
with Robert Novak, a University of Illinois graduate, as a matter of fact, who died in 2009. But now the title apparently belongs solely to Perley, who was one of the
This
head...
is Pearl, doesn't
Who
it?
is Pearl?
Pearl, okay.
I don't know. I think he
Richard
No,
does.
he
Pearl.
says Pearl.
Yeah.
Pearl, okay. He was one of the
Pearly
foremost
Gates.
neoconservative warmongers in 2002 and so on. And he was saying that we should have no sympathy for the Palestinians or the inhabitants of Gaza. The same thing has been said recently by Norman Podhoretz, that he is not wasting any sympathy on the Palestinians. And we've seen a remarkably sustained and loud performance of the line that, we have to blame the victims. The Palestinians have brought this on themselves. They are guilty of trying to defend themselves. Actually, they have no right to do that. They brought it on themselves. They had it coming. What did they expect? So that line is being used very heavily, and it's amazing to see the intensity with which this is being pronounced and promoted without people thinking through the implications of what they're saying. A lot of media attention has been devoted this week to identifying the villain of the piece. So according to various people, the villain in Ukraine is Putin, or maybe it's Obama. In Gaza, it's Bibi, or maybe Obama, who knows. I was reminded of the headline in the AP Dispatch, Israeli mood turns dark with mounting casualties. It was a really exuberant account of the conflict there. For a while, when the Israelis were killing hundreds of Palestinians, but when the Palestinians fought back and began killing a dozen or more Israeli soldiers, then the whole mood apparently has shifted. So what are we to make of that? The whole scene of finger pointing, who's the guilty party, leaves me kind of cold. The traffic and atrocity stories has become so overwhelming that it has, I think, kind of numbed me to the whole affair. Who do we blame? Who do we point the finger of guilt at? I'm not much impressed by any of those stories. And I think we still need to piece together for themselves what's going on here. If you like atrocity stories, I'll add one today on Facebook. There were pictures of Israelis who live near the barrier, the wall, gathering on a hilltop there overlooking Gaza. They had brought out couches and chairs and were having snacks and drinking beer while they were cheering on the Israeli airstrikes, the bombs dropping on Gaza. So you can tell me, well, that means nothing. Or you can say, as some people do when they fasten upon other certain details, it's a horrible atrocity and it proves something or other about guilt and innocence and so on. And again, I remain skeptical of all those stories, but personally, I'm not ready to render any final judgment on any of this, but overwhelmingly, I think the Israelis are to be blamed for mass murder. Another story this week, 64 public figures, including 7 Nobel Peace Prize winners, have called the Israeli onslaught there a crime against humanity. The statement came in a letter published in Britain's Guardian on Friday. So that's where the judgment stands. Of course, it's always subject to revision as we find out more, but it's impossible generally to get any hard information about who's doing what. And the fog of war is obscuring a lot of this so much that I just view the whole thing with dismay and mounting horror. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. Comments? Okay.
Okay, I agree with Ron that a lot of this, you won't see anything on my Facebook vilifying anybody in relation to what you just mentioned, because those are incidents that often may be wrong. An example, evidently there was a photograph of a Russian separatist in the Ukraine holding up a toy, okay? And it went viral, okay? And people were outraged that he was holding this up as if it was a catch or something he was looting. I've seen the actual film that was taken of him. He then put down the toy, took off his hat, and made the sign of the cross. What he was actually doing was showing respect for that child that had died and lost his toy. But you see, they take a photograph, it goes viral, and you spread hatred. So these individual incidences of people, whether they're, I mean, like showing, there are so many Jews in Tel Aviv that were beaten up because they were actually in a protest against the war, and they were beaten up by thugs. So it's not about individuals. We're talking about class war 100%, okay? And so we should not be vilifying individuals. We need to go after the governments and recognize that our government is a perpetrator and we are responsible for what our government does, but at the same time we should not be vilifying other individuals who may be as impotent as we are right now.
Yeah, I agree that there are demented fools and evildoers on every side of every issue like this.
Right.
And that's why I had some question about what David said, as if this is a matter of popularity. And there's a whole tendency, I think, for politics in this country, in the name of a misunderstood notion of democracy, to ask who's the most popular, who's getting the most press, and so on. And I don't decide anything on that basis. It's a fact that has to be taken into account sometimes. But in general, politics and political thinking in this country has degenerated very largely into a matter of something like a high school popularity contest.
Actually, you're right.
And I reject all that.
You're right. No, absolutely. It's like the bully out on the playground, you know? It's like the bully on the playground, getting all the other kids to join him while he picks on some poor kid. And it's the vilification of individuals. This is what we have to get away from. Whether it's their religion, their race, their nationality, this is what we have to stop doing.
Well, there's still a place for that, I think, an ultimate moral responsibility. But
That's a
most people
different
get to that too
situation.
quickly. I mean,
Yeah.
their judgments are premature.
But doesn't that answer your question, the question you started with, Ron, you know, about who's the guilty party? Surely we have to ask that question. The point is get the answer right, not to get it wrong. I mean, David and I were talking about the events of our youth, and for many people of our vintage, the Vietnam War was a great exercise in learning who the guilty party was. Most Americans thought, as the war began, that the U.S. was doing a noble thing, helping poor people in Southeast Asia stop a communist menace that was going to corrupt their lives terribly, and certainly Americans should sacrifice to do that. It was our responsibility. We had a responsibility to protect, although the phrase hadn't been coined, and Americans supported on that ground. What the learning of the Vietnam War years was to realize that we had misidentified the villain. The villain was an imperial invader that dropped more ordnance on a peasant society than was used in all of World War II, and it was doing it for its purposes of worldwide economic control. But that was a painful lesson, but an absolutely necessary one.
Yeah.
What we had to do was decide who the guilty party was.
Yes, well,
Right?
that comes with painful deliberation and experience and so on. My point was
That's what we're here for, right?
Yeah, not to rush into these judgments.
I think certainly in the 60s it would have been great if we had convinced more Americans to rush to a judgment that they had been sold a bill of goods by groups like the New York Times.
I agree.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Deb Johnson with some reflections on that downed passenger liner and airliner in Ukraine.
Yes, this article was written by Finney and Cunningham from Dandelion Salad. Downed airliner, fake audio tape shows U.S.-backed hit to frame Russia. And I'm just going to read some of the most important things because we don't have a lot of time. Within hours of Malaysian airline flight MH17 crashing into a wheat field in the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine last Thursday, Western governments and media have gradually stoked a frenzy of accusations that Moscow had a hand in the disaster. Western fingers of blame began pointing at Russia the day following the crash, when U.S. President Barack Obama announced that unnamed American intelligence sources said that the suspected surface-to-air missile believed to have taken the jet down was fired from territory held by anti-Kiev self-defense militias, or as Obama put it, quote, Russian-backed separatist. Over the weekend, the accusations against Russia from Western governments and media have steadily grown to a crescendo. In his usual round of Sunday television programs, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry went as far as claiming that American intelligence was now certain that Russia had supplied the missile system to the militia in eastern Ukraine. And I'm not even going to talk about anything else that Mr. Kerry had to say. I'm going to skip that part. Subordinate ministers went even further in their accusations. Britain's new defense minister, Michael Fallon, told media that Russia was, quote, sponsoring terrorism in Ukraine on the back of the stricken airliner incident. However, it is clear from a closer reading of the media reports carried in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the British press that the alleged case for implicating Russia relies on a mixture of anonymous assertions by unidentified U.S. intelligence officials, fragments of unverified phone intercepts, and unverified video and photographs. The latter images purport to show a Buck launcher and its missiles being driven across the Ukrainian border into Russia. It is impossible to verify if the alleged location and time is accurate. The Western media frenzy over the weekend, based on all the above evidence, produced headlines such as, quote, Putin's rebels blew up plane in Britain's Daily Express, quote, Ukraine claims compelling evidence of Russian involvement in the British Guardian, and, quote, U.S. sees evidence of Russian link to jets downing in the New York Times. This political and media stampede to impugn Moscow and Russian President Vladimir Putin in particular is telling in itself of a premeditated black operation. But then came this devastating twist. Russian audio recording experts revealed over the weekend that the intercepts invoked by Kiev and its Western supporters turned out to be fake. Reputed digital sound analyst Nikolai Popov and his expert team examined the files made public by Kiev intelligence services, and they found that the files had been doctored from separate and unrelated conversations. On first hearing, the alleged conversations tend to implicate the self-defense militia in firing a missile at the passenger plane. But on closer examination, the digital fingerprints show that the files were fabricated, taken from separate recordings and spliced together to give the impression of integral conversations. Quote, "This audio recording is not an integral file and is made up of several fragments," Popov told Russian news agency TASS. Moreover, and this is crucial, the sound analysis of digital data shows that the tapes were engineered the day before flight MH17 was seemingly hit by a missile and blown out of the sky. This latest discovery makes for some incontrovertible and deeply unsettling conclusions. Firstly, parties were involved in deliberately forging the files with the purpose of framing others, the self-defense militia in Moscow. Secondly, and more disturbingly, the people who faked the files must have known that the airliner was going to be hit with a missile or some other catastrophic eternal force in order to bring it down with all the horrific loss of life entailed. In all the maelstrom of Western innuendo against Russia over the doomed airliner, the obvious anomaly is that neither the Moscow nor the anti-Kiev rebels would have anything to remotely gain by carrying out such a dastardly act. Furthermore, the eastern Ukraine self-defense militia have categorically denied possessing such weaponry and the skill to operate these radar control systems. But here is more potentially damning information on who the culprits are. Russia's Ministry of Defense says that it has radar data showing that an anti-aircraft, Buk missile launcher was operated by the Kiev forces in the vicinity of the doomed airliner, and that these Kiev forces had the plane in their radar target sites. A digital recording could easily verify that claim. In addition, there are several other troubling questions that the Kiev regime has so far refused to answer. Why was flight MH17 instructed by Kiev air traffic control to fly on this unusual, more northerly route on that fateful day through a dangerous conflict zone? Also, why were the pilots of MH17 instructed to fly at the lower altitude of 33,000 feet instead of 35,000 feet? Taking all this into account, the finger of suspicion now points not at Moscow, but rather at the Kiev regime and its military forces. More damningly, given the close dependence of the Kiev junta on American government sponsorship for military operations, the ongoing deep involvement of the CIA in bringing this regime to power in the first place, with the illegal coup back in February, and given the concerted way that Washington has sought to exploit the airliner disaster for geopolitical gains, all that strongly points to a deeply criminal conclusion. A criminal collusion that involves the deliberate shooting down of a civilian flight and killing nearly 300 people. And again, Finney and Cunningham, you can find this article on dandelion salad. And briefly, I just would like to recommend another article on the same information by, hold on a second, by Paul Craig Roberts, called What Happened to Malaysian Airliner, and you can find that at paulcraigroberts.com.
Thank you, Deb. Comments, ladies and gentlemen?
Yeah, I'm glad Deb read that, because I've been privy to all the same information related, and it is looking more and more as if the shooting down did come from Kiev. And it certainly fits the pattern of things that have been happening, and I won't, I mean, I speculate a lot on a lot of these things that have happened. But I want to quote Stephen Cohen, who is a Russian scholar, and he said, and I'm taking this perspective myself at this moment, he said, what's happening in Gaza is happening in East Ukraine, East Ukrainian cities, bombing, shelling, mortaring by the Kiev government. And it's backed by at least 150% by the White House, okay, and the State Department. Now, how many people have died there? We don't know. Probably several 100,000 refugees have already run from those cities. Donetsk, Luhansk, and I don't pronounce these very well, Slovansk, and some more. He said, we know something about Gaza, but we know nothing about the East Ukraine. And he points out, there is no evidence, just political speculation right now, and a rush to judgment, a political rush to judgment, especially on the part of the U.S. So we have to look and consider, I mean, there are a lot of questions to be asked, and some are being, again, all of these are being put forward, but until the thorough investigation by air crash authorities is conducted, we won't really have evidence to back up anything. And one of the things that I noted was that on the radio this morning, I was listening 94.5, a woman saying, and here's the way I see the propaganda spin. She said, oh, the bodies were just delivered to Dutch, whatever.
Forensics, yeah.
Yeah, and due to, they were finally delivered due to international pressure. And I thought, wait a minute, that's not true. The bodies were, I knew they were on the train, and I knew they were being delivered yesterday, just as well as I knew that yesterday the black box was handed over to Malaysian airline or Malaysian government, which is what, that was the proper thing for them to do. Just imagine, these are separatist rebels out there fighting, and suddenly they're surrounded by bodies, broken bodies, which from my understanding were people were finding on their rooftops, broken through their homes as much as 10 miles away. Imagine picking up these body parts and having, you can't do that overnight. So to say that, oh, well, you know, they were looting, or they were doing this, or they were doing that. So all I'm saying is that just her remark that it was due to international pressure, we don't know that either. But that is definitely the spin that's been given on the U.S. corporate-owned media. So I think we need to really withhold judgment until there's some evidence out there. Of course, the real question is who are the investigators going to be, and will there be anything left?
Right, and it has to be an international type deal, you know, because look
Well,
what happened on 9/11. I mean, all the steel they shipped to China. They didn't even look at it. They put it on boats and they sent it away. So there wasn't even a real investigation.
There is a UN. They did, I think yesterday, the UN did come out and say that there has to be an international investigation of this. But
well,
here again, who the international parties will be, let's hope that they will be impartial.
Yeah.
Another tiny consideration, it's said that Kiev refuses to release the air control records that they had just before the shoot down.
And that's very telling right there.
Yeah, it is.
That's very telling.
There's another story, again, you never know, I don't know what to make of this, that there was a Kievan fighter in the air close to the airliner.
Well, I've seen,
that time.
I've seen reports of another airplane. But again,
there were some witness reports that made it to copy that I've read.
Me too.
And the separatists basically didn't even have anything to shoot at because they didn't even have any planes or anything. So it seems pretty clear what's going on.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Evans-Levy with some comments about what's going on around town in regard to anti-war demonstrations.
There was a special demonstration last Sunday in support of Palestine and against the U.S. support of the Israeli attacks on Gaza. About 50 people showed up for it, and we show pictures from the demonstration right here in Champaign. And there will be another demonstration this Saturday from 9 to 11, and it'll be out by the county courthouse on Main Street here in Urbana this time. And please come out and join us. Come out and talk to us if you want to. there'll be a lot of people. There were a lot of people of all ages at the last one.
Yeah.
We got some really great pictures of some of the, and we also had a lot of people giving support from their vehicles and stuff too, saying that they supported us and taking the literature that we were handing out. And we will have some more flyers then too. Also, where we'll have a table at the farmers market at the same time if you want to come by and just get the flyer from there as well. And the farmers market is from 7 to noon, and we will have information and conversation there too. But definitely come out and see the demonstration. And it's a lot of people, it's a lot of different representation than typical peace demonstrations around here, so it's worth coming out and seeing and talking to people.
Will the focus be on Ukraine or Gaza or both?
It's on Gaza.
Gaza, yeah. And this is,
But as Ron is suggesting, and as a couple of people already said, there are parallels, and they should be talked about.
oh,
Right,
absolutely,
right.
absolutely.
And I'll also mention that there are demonstrations, in particular on Gaza, across the world that have been happening all week, this past Sunday and also this Saturday. And I'm not sure if anybody's demonstrating about the Ukraine and stuff.
No.
Whether people are out,
I
because
haven't
nobody
seen
wants to
anything.
know, nobody knows what's really going
Right,
on there right
right.
now.
Well, and part of our job is to talk about that and tell people about it.
Right, and,
Right.
and what the involvement of the United States is in it as well.
Exactly.
All right,
And relationships to other things happening, yeah.
right.
Thank you, Karen. Other comments?
Well, I think the demonstration was great.
Yep.
It was
It
amazing.
was just so heart-lifting to see those little girls actually had little protests
Yeah.
that they were verbally using, and it was just wonderful.
Little chance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite sign from that demonstration was there was a sign that said, "Stop the war," and then "war" was crossed out, and it says "slaughter" or
Yeah.
"massacre" or
Yeah.
something. Yeah, because it really isn't a war, because
That's
a
a very
war
good point.
implies that there's
The
two sides.
equal.
That,
Yeah, that
there's
it's equal, and it really isn't equal.
It's not.
It's a
There's-
slaughter,
yeah.
yeah. No, I enjoyed having a chat with a couple of the Indonesian students that are here that came to it, so.
We'll turn our attention to the pivot to Asia. Karen Aram talking about what the American government is doing in regard to
Well-
the Middle East and Asia.
yeah, well, and-
there have been developments there, once again, badly reported.
A few,
in,
but
corporate media.
They pale in comparison. I will just point out that based upon discussions I've had with AWARE over the past year in respect to Thailand, their military government, which is oppressing in many ways, although you'll still see people going there, tourists, et cetera, and saying, or people who live and do business in Bangkok saying, oh, everything's fine now, it's quiet. Yeah, it's quiet because all the pressure is on that no protest now. But basically, Thailand has since canceled their railroad project, since I was actually on here last week. They have canceled the railroad project, and they're putting the money allocated to that is going into other projects throughout. I don't know enough about them to know how worthwhile they are. However, I do know that they're purchasing F-16s from the United States. Their military is. So I think that's very telling, and that's within just a couple of weeks of the military government taking over. The Indonesian election, which I referred to, whereby Prabowo Subianto, he is the general who was involved in massacres in the 90s. He is our man, by the way. The U.S. trained him at our school in Georgia. What is it? Our School of Torture Tactics,
The
etc.
School of Americas, it
Yeah.
used to be called until the name became so besmirched that
Right.
the U.S. had to change it
Yeah, well,
to
they-
something bureaucratic.
It's kind of like Blackwater. They keep changing the name.
Exactly,
I can't keep up.
that's right.
But
To-
we all
to
know
protect the
it-
guilty.
But we all know it's Blackwater, and we know what they're responsible for. In fact, Blackwater, they are the same group that trained some of the Indonesian military, and they have a different name. I reported on that last week. But the point is that the election had his opponent win, and his name is, they call him Jokoko, but his name is Widodo. He actually came out on top, but of course they had a recount. Well, the recount was completed on the 22nd, which was, I think, yesterday in Indonesia. In the meantime, Subianto, what I had written down yesterday was that Subianto was attempting to delay the content, or to delay the recount. as much as he possibly could in order for him to take it to the Constitutional Court. And he said he needed time for his legal team to gather evidence. Well, he said they need more time. As of this morning, after the recount, he actually withdrew. He completely withdrew before it was completed, and he is now taking it to the Constitutional Court, claiming that the election was not, that it was corrupt and that it was illegitimate, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is the first time this has happened in Indonesia since 1999, I believe. And in fact, people who had reported on the election said that they had seen no corruption, they had seen no problems. But this is a stalling there's definitely a stalling tactic on his part. So I'm concerned about what's going to happen. In the meantime, they have the military out, they have all the police out, they are very concerned about what they call outflow from the cities. So I'm not quite sure what that means. It doesn't mean that they have protesters coming into the cities. It means they have people fleeing from the cities. So anything could happen right now. So I'll be watching it.
I must admit, the cynic in me thinks that this hesitation between the election and the declaration that Widodo actually won had to do with negotiations with representatives from Washington to see how willing Widodo would be to be biddable.
I think you're absolutely
to
right.
do what he was told.
Yeah.
You know.
Wow.
In
And
fact,
then,
I found Widodo extremely diplomatic
yeah.
when he was
That's
asked.
a nice word for it.
Yeah, when he was asked the question, I mean, because you had some columnists saying that neither one will withdraw. Neither one will withdraw from the race. Like, I thought, well, why would the guy who came out on top, why would he want to withdraw and to the opponent who lost? And when Widodo was asked about Subianto's attempts at claiming it's illegitimate or illegal, he diplomatically said, well, I think he must have just reason or something like that. But it was very diplomatic, and I thought, okay, that's... So I don't know enough about him except he's a former governor, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's sort of a populist, as we would say in this country.
Yes,
I mean, someone
yes,
who
right.
has a popular following. And the U.S. was worried indeed about someone with a popular following in Indonesia. As you've pointed out before, Indonesia was central to the Vietnam War.
Right.
That the U.S. was immensely concerned about the developments in the world's largest Muslim country, as you described it, and that the CIA organized massacre of 1 million people in 1965 was celebrated by American officials as a triumph of the Vietnam War. That's what we're fighting for, we were saying, to make sure that we have control over the economy of basically the Asian economy, then particularly centered on Japan. But Indonesia being an essential part of that, the U.S. was willing to kill a lot of people, at least 1 million, in order to make sure that their writ ran in Indonesia. And all these years later, an election in Indonesia carries that same importance for the United States.
Absolutely, and they know that the military, one of the things that they want, of course, always, I think, is more military weapons, and in order to control, and they want them from the U.S., more of them. It has to be pointed out, Indonesia is a very oil-rich nation, okay?
Yes.
Very oil-rich, and that was the concern during the Vietnam War. We cannot lose Indonesia to the communists. That was the biggest fear,
And the reason the
Because
U.S.
of the
was
oil.
willing to back Indonesia against the East Timor independence movement and kill an awful lot of people there, too.
It's another atrocious
was,
slaughter.
yes, to make sure that that's control. The idea that these things are happening in a faraway country of which we know little is about the most unlikely aspect of the American approach to Indonesia.
I think this is what's frightening, is that we do know so little about what's happening there. There's a lot of focus right now on Gaza, and of course we don't get the best information about anything, and then all these things start happening elsewhere in the world. I mean, the Ukraine is the most frightening, there's no question. I mean, here's Russia with the Ukraine, which is right there on their doorstep, and nuclear weapons. What would we do, what did we do when Russia had started building nuclear weapons in Cuba?
Right.
So,
right,
you know,
right on the...
What would we do if Mexico or Canada, suddenly somebody was putting nuclear weapons? NATO decided to come over and set them up on our borders.
But see, that was that fundamental principle that all Americans accepted. The U.S. government could do things that no other government could do.
Right.
The U.S. government could put atomic weapons on the border of a foreign country, but the Russians certainly couldn't do that.
Right.
Or
Exactly.
the Soviets, in this case.
Missiles
the
at
Soviets
Cuba.
could do that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
What's
So-
happening in the Ukraine is a march to war, and I think
Yeah.
it's something we really do have to keep a close eye
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, and I applaud Putin for trying to keep us cool.
Yes.
Considering,
God,
you know,
yes.
now that all this new information's coming
Yeah.
out about what happened to this plane, I mean, you know, bravo, Mr. Putin. Let's hope you can continue that.
Yeah.
Continue that.
It is important that Putin is probably the most popular leader in the developed world. Probably, there's nobody, you know, nobody even close to him in the other developed countries. He has the backing of his own population and a good deal of support from elsewhere as well. Now, Putin's no better than he should be. I mean, you don't become the leader of a post-Soviet state by baking cookies. That's only
Right.
Victoria Nuland, right?
Well,
Unless
yeah.
they're laced with radioactive stuff.
Well,
you
it's
might
like
make cookies.
people would say, well, Thaksin had to go in Thailand because he was corrupt. And I'm like, wait a minute, you have to define corruption. Because there was nobody, no leader in Thailand who could ever not be corrupt in some respect. It's what he does for the people. Oh, yes, on that point in Thailand, the military now is coming out. And the universal health care that Thaksin had implemented, now that's being torn away. Just one other thing that the military government there is doing. Yeah, no universal health care for
Yeah,
poor
military
people.
government.
One last comment on Putin. It seems to me perfectly reasonable to believe that what happened in eastern Ukraine was indeed a shooting down of a plane by the so-called separatists. They're not, in fact, separatists at all. Rather, they are demanding a self-rule.
Nationalist?
I love the fact the United States says, well, it was done with a Russian military system. Yes, that's right, a Russian anti-aircraft system, because both sides, the Kiev government and the independents, have Soviet military
Right.
systems.
Right, of course.
But I thought the best comment was actually Putin's original one. He said, "Look, none of this would have happened if the war had not been launched by Kiev government
In the first place.
against the separatists in the
Right,
east."
right.
Which is certainly
That's
true.
exactly
Well, as
right.
Stephen Cohen has said, this is the last thing Putin would have wanted to happen. This does
Exactly.
not, there is no motive
Right.
for him whatsoever to have this happen.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 30th week of 2014. Thanks to Jason Liggett and Joseph Cash for direction and production, thanks to whom also this program and others like it are available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. This is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, Deb Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.